I ran into guys like Kirk Webster and Michael Palmer who lived just, about an hour, 45 minutes to 2 hours away. And that these men were living these lives with their bees in a way I've never even was exposed to. It's just such a, I don't know how to describe it. It just really changed everything about kind of where I thought I was going to go as a person and my idea of beekeeping. I'm really thankful to have the opportunity to uh, present, share with you my experience, my thoughts, kind of like what I guess is at the present state of where I'm at in life and with bees, kind of how I look and see things and what beekeeping is to me, what it is as far as for a vocation for me and what I think is a pretty, it's not the only way to do it because, we don't need just one way. But I think that the way that what I'll share today is kind of a forgotten and overlooked route or avenue or road, path, whatever you want to call it, one could take. It's been kind of overlooked, I think, just because of the culture we live in some regards. And there's many nuances and facets to that, whether it's just like how we live our lives, what we, seek after for, what it is that makes up, our lives outside of, work and family and all of it combined. But I guess the thing I want to try to drive home are 2 points. I want to share with you guys the overall management that I use to be successful on a small commercial apiary that's diversified and doing three kind of tiers of management. And at the same time, I want to share with you kind of like a little bit of a philosophical kind of a why I've why I've kind of arrived at this and why I really feel that there's something kind of overlooked here. And I understand that what I'm doing is definitely not going to be for everybody because there's many, as we all know, beekeeping is complex. It's the environment you live in, that the bees are subjected to. There's a lot of nuances to all of this. So what I'm doing is obviously kind of morphed into the environment that I work and live in, and I've made this kind of fit my, me mentally and personally, plus the environment, that the bees have to operate in. So the nice thing about all of this, in regards to kind of like this thing working, right, is that it's there's nothing new in regards to how this is played out in the idea and the mindset of a farmer. And that's kind of the primary thing I want to drive home for a lot of folks is that there's kind of been this, and I say this with humility, but I feel like there's this lost approach to agriculture within our culture, being, the United States in general. There's just such a huge disconnect from how things are actually produced in general, and then how food is produced, in regards to agriculture. So I want to I think that my commercial beekeeping has a huge, obviously market share. It supports a lot, but within the commercial realm, the non-migratory, small kind of family farm oriented scale, if you will, this what I'm going to share about in regards to how I manage my apiary around this small commercial number is is really got a lot to offer. I think it has. I think that there's within the small commercial apiary, there's things to be tapped into that I think the larger commercial guys are going to miss that. And I say this with humility because I don't, I know enough. I'm not ignorant of what is going on in larger apiaries commercially, but at the same time, I can kind of see little nuances. And I think that when you're smaller and you can dial things in, you really can focus on specific things or a handful of things or one or two things, and quality is, I hate to say that because I don't think words kind of describe all this. There's so many nuances to it, but for the sake of conversation, I think there's some quality aspects. There's some intuitive kind of things that are just kind of overlooked or lessened because of the sheer size and scope and manpower, infrastructure. They're just, the bigger things are, the more I think spread out your your view has to be on a given operation. And I think the smaller, if you can dial it in, you can kind of have a tighter view on management, on breeding, on production, on problem solving. Not that problem solving is unique to anybody, but it kind of just everything is unique to the situation. So I want to try to emphasize how kind of lost and forgotten the uniqueness of small commercial apiaries are. And I mean, there's always been a discussion over the years of, what does it take, to be a commercial beekeeper? And in the last, I don't know, seems like in the last decade, last 5 years, there's been a big push, not a push, but an interest for people to consider and take up beekeeping as a vocation. And so the number always is, well, what do you need to be a commercial beekeeper? And obviously the texts have always said that, 300 colonies or is kind of like the entry level point to commercial beekeeping. But I think that, in general, you could probably, it really depends on what you need for revenue at the same time. But my point is, like, let's just say 300, 200 colonies, is a good baseline where I think if over some time with production, you can start to see some nice revenue coming in from your apiary if managed well and then you're in a good environment. So, anyways, forgive me because Zoom is a new platform. I don't do a lot of Zoom presentations, but it's nice to have audience interaction. And without that today, I'm just kind of, reading off some notes here. So as we get into this, which I'm going to do now, I want to, if you guys had looked at the schedule today, you can kind of see that there's a lot of interesting things that are kind of that are unique and similar in a lot of ways. We look at speakers after me. There's going to be discussions and presentations around queen rearing and specific methods of whether it's raising queen cells or production of queens and other people's take and their experiences on that. We have, we're going to look like there'll be some discussions and presentations around varroa mites. We have the latest and greatest kind of with what it's coming up with. I think there's a discussion. Oh, hang on a minute. Where did my sheet go? I'm just looking at the schedule. I got the wrong paper. Yeah, like just
do you need a face to look at, Troy? If it helps you, I can pop my camera on.
No, I'm good. I'll just
Okay.
I'll let you know if I'm floundering, but I think I got. But yeah, just like the fact that my point, I guess I want to get to the point here. I can linger and try to explain things. I think that this conference has a good focus on the big issues and problems in our industry. I think that we as an industry and the beekeeping industry has kind of ridden on this train or this apparatus. The mindset that's currently got us where we are has served its purpose, but we're now starting to find, and there's cool things starting to come up in regards to new technologies within just breeding, new tools that are available all over the place. I mean, just look at the innovative things that are happening because of this influx of new people into bees within the last 2 decades. They've brought their ideas and their passion, their desire with them, and it's kind of like it's revamping the industry. So I approached this whole thing in the onset of my apiary. Obviously, I've been known. I think my reputation kind of goes before me as like the treatment-free guy, and I started out my apiary obviously with treatment-free, and I did so in the result for the pure kind of mindset or the motive behind being treatment-free was for breeding. And at the beginning of all this in the early 2000s, if you guys have been doing this long enough, there was a lot of skepticism in the industry that breeding for mite resistance was actually going to do anything. I don't know if you guys, have been at it long enough, but it was a big discussion and a lot of people kind of just didn't put a lot of effort. The industry, I should say. There's a very, very small percentage of people, namely some really good queen breeders at the time and some research and academics, I guess, that were kind of pursuing the idea or more than pursuing, but actually kind of starting the empathy of mite resistance, for breeding for mite resistance. And I got into this as some just little beekeeper up here in New England that just wanted to do it on a scale, but at the same time breed and see if there's so many green shoots that would sprout up from a breeding program that was using no treatments. And I must say that there was a lot that I learned. And I always tell people I built my apiary on no treatments. Obviously, I experienced a huge die-off, which I won't get into, a couple years ago and built back up, and I kind of had to kind of come at things a little bit differently to mitigate risk. But at the same time, still today, I'm treating a very small population of my bees every year, and I'm still quite successful, very successful, and every farmer stands on one season at a time. We can't boast about what we're going to do in the future because we don't have any control over that stuff. But my point is that the industry's got us this far. And I think the future lies in a lot of what we're looking at now lies in breeding. And I think a lot of people would agree with me with that. My good friend who's coming up behind me, Corey Stevens, is going to share like what he's up to. And Kira Wagner's also got what she's, the UBO, all this stuff that's coming available to actually measure these things in breeding, I think are the future, has a huge role to play in the future. And I think will yield huge results. And I think it's been a long time coming. If we just would have focused on this stuff early on in the days, 20, 30 years ago, hindsight being 2020, and we can't go back in the past. But my point is that the quick fix of just coming up with the one all, varroa treatment that's going to keep the whole thing going, I think has served its purpose, and it's needed. But at the same time, there's been too much emphasis on that. So my apiary, what I'm doing essentially to tie back into like the conference, what I'm going to share about is a way to encapsulate everything that's going to be talked about today into a management scheme. Obviously, my management scheme is going to be a little bit different from other people's because of environmental conditions, but that's the thing I want to really drive home. The small commercial apiary, and in particular to what I've been doing, encapsulates everything we're going to talk about. And it allows room for research, for development, for personal, growth in regards to being, improving upon your skill set as a beekeeper. At the same time, all the fun and benefits and hard work of, just running a farm and being able to do that and, with your family or, a partner, or whatever you want to do. So that's what I really want to start this whole conversation with. I'm going to get into it here. So introduction, you already know who I am. I live in Plainfield. I operate Hall apiaries. Started this as a hobby 2005, and I discovered that it was even possible to do this. That was my like big turning point in my young life in my 20s, that I ran into guys like Kirk Webster and Michael Palmer, who lived just, about an hour, 45 minutes to 2 hours away. And that these men were living these lives with their bees in a way I've never even was exposed to. It's just I don't know how to describe it. It just really changed everything about kind of where I thought I was going to go as a person and my idea of beekeeping. So I really just stumbled into what they were doing and said, boy, oh boy, I got to at least try to do what they do, what they're doing. If I can, and it seems so far off at the time, in my 20s, in my early 20s, I was thinking, well, how many years is it going to take to get me to where I'm at, where these guys are at? And, it's taken a while. I'd say 10 years to finally get to a point, from the onset of where I could actually start to feel like I had an apiary that was providing me some revenue and an ability to live without another source of income coming in. But regardless, I met these beekeepers. They completely blew my hair back in a way, for lack of a better way to describe it. So what I do, I manage 300 colonies for honey production. Try to raise around 300 to 400 nucleus colonies, and we run around 400 mating nucleus colonies to mate queen bees in. And Greg Rogers, met him at the Bee Expo in Louisville for the first time. I've seen him before in the past, but he's a beekeeper in Nashville, North Carolina. Great guy. It's done this a little longer than I have, and he termed what I'm doing and what he's doing. He says this is just the old-fashioned way to keep bees commercially. So that's one way to kind of look at what I'm about to present. It's a little bit more old-fashioned. It's before everything got palletized, everything got thrown on semis, and the agriculture kind of got more consolidated into bigger farms, which required inputs to be brought in for things to be produced. And one of those inputs obviously being pollinators and certain aspects of farming. So what we're doing is kind of the old-fashioned way. You're working it out on a piece of land that you happen to live on or you move to, and you're just working it out one season to the next. So here's where I live. This map is a little bit compressed, but essentially it's central west, kind of right out in New Hampshire, but right on the Vermont border. So right on the Connecticut River Valley. Good place. It's kind of an overlooked area for bees, in my opinion, or not in my opinion, but in reality. A lot of commercial guys are up in the Champlain Valley for what commercial beekeeping, what's available in the area. Vermont up on the Champlain Valley is probably like a little slice of Wisconsin that was dropped on the, kind of right there on the Adirondacks and the foothills of the Green Mountains there in Vermont. New Hampshire's not really a bee-friendly state, to be honest with you. You kind of get further east off the Connecticut River Valley. It's really, it's the New Hampshire is known as the Granite State. So acidic, sandy soils, really mountainous, lots of forests. So there are places that are good, but the when it comes to forage being so heavily forested, your nectar, the bees that will kind of struggle in points of the year where there's not a lot of forage. Here's a quick uh, window for you guys to see what the climate is like up here temperature wise. This is just from NOAA. I forget the span of time. I think this is like a 10-year average per month where I'm at. So you can kind of get an idea for what I'm working with. It's funny looking at this, especially for January and February. It's like, man, those minimum temps, they got to be colder than that. It feels like it anyway, some years, but that's what NOAA's reporting. So that's what it is. Here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to go through this presentation in kind of like, again, a management overview, how I manage this apiary to the scale and that makes this whole thing work. And we're going to go through the spring, summer, and fall kind of seasonal management. And there's three aspects to this that make it work. The three tiers of management: queen breeding, honey production, and nucleus colonies. Those are so important. And the trick is trying to make all these areas of management throughout the season work together and function as a cohesive unit. And obviously, every year is different. As a farmer, as just work, anyone who works outside, you just can't copy and paste your schedule and your your efforts that you executed last year onto this year, because it's just not going to work. You're going to fail, or you're going to find that you're just not going to be productive because you're working with different seasonal seasonal differences, which are pretty complex. So every season has, like, it's the bullet point here, is that every season has its own push and pull. And that's the biggest thing I think for people to understand, especially for those that have no idea about farming, is that the priorities, right? We all come to the table every day with the priorities or with expectations. And as a farmer myself, I've had to kind of learn what this is like for me, in particular to where I live, is that I have to show up and sometimes be ready to just take the eraser almost to the chalkboard and completely just wipe it clean and start again. I had an idea what I thought I was going to do, but I showed up and things are completely different. Or, in a sense, you're kind of doing that on a kind of a whole management kind of ideal. If you kind of set forth thinking, well, I have to do this with these bees, you can show up and be like, well, it's just not going to happen this way this year. There's just not enough rain. Things aren't working together. I got to really kind of maybe do something a little different. I can see how I can be productive with this, but I have to adjust. And I think if you can't be flexible in that way mentally and physically, you're just going to be broken upon the rock in a sense. You'll just shatter, and I think there's a lot of stress that's incurred there. And if not dealt with properly, you just find, that it's just not, you're not going to be cut out for the work. So every season has its own pull on priorities and order, how things are carried out and accomplished. And obviously, like everybody knows, diversity is key, right? And if anybody here is in agriculture, you got to have more than just one thing that you're utilizing for revenue in the sense of farming. So diversity is key, and obviously diversity within just the management, but within the actual ecosystem and the bees themselves. You think about all the different levels and different facets that we're talking about here. It's more than just this plan and this management thing, but it's multi-layered on all areas of life and reality. So, and I think the biggest thing that I like about this apiary and the paradigm is that I think resources are really used to the greatest potential, and obviously for the present and for the future. And I say for the present because if I look around what I do every year, and there's really not a lot that goes to waste when it comes to bees and their ability to be productive. And I look at what I'm doing in regards to breeding, and I think this is the way forward. I'm willing to sacrifice. I hope I can remember. I'm going to touch base on a few management things, but there's a lot of things I do that a lot of people don't understand, and I think that it's hard for me to articulate in those moments that I choose to it just becomes so normal for me. I don't even know how to explain it. It's just what I do. But a lot of what I've kind of set forth years ago to do was for the idea of something better for the future. So it's like my bottom line is important at the end of the day, but I'm willing to kind of go about doing things in a different way for the sake of future benefit. So that's a huge thing that I'd like to kind of touch base on here a little later. So, and overall, this management scheme strengthens the overall population of bees through queen breeding and natural selection. and I want to emphasize natural selection because, like I shared earlier, in this particular type of apiary footprint or paradigm, I really think as a beekeeper, for like I said, I traditionally have used no treatments, and in the last 3 years, I've only used one round of Formic Pro in my whole apiary on probably, I don't know, some years it's been 30% of my honey production colonies, and just this last year, it's like barely 20% of the honey production colonies. So very minimal chemical dependence for success. And that's for me, right? Everyone's got to figure that out. And if you got to treat your bees to keep them alive, you got to do that. But I'm just saying there's the potential. And I think with some time and with some know-how, there's a lot more people that can arrive in this place that I feel like I've kind of, been able to dance the dance with. And the beautiful thing about this is, one or two people can do all the work. And in my case, where I have a young family, it'd be nice to see if I can incorporate, the family into doing this and see what the future brings in regards to that. So nice little picture here. I got plenty of pictures, but this is a picture of a typical yard of colonies producing honey. I'm not going to get lost in it too much here because I want to kind of keep moving forward for the sake of time. But I just do the typical 2 deep brood nests. I used to use queen excluders. I don't use them anymore. Well, no, excuse me. I used to not use them, but I do use them. And the reason why I do is because I really enjoyed using escape boards to harvest the crop of honey. Um, and I can, I guess, elaborate on that if there's some questions around why I do. But there's something about the kind of organized method of using escape boards pulling honey, and at the same time knowing that the queen is always, for the most part, below the excluder where she ought to be, for management and just for knowing that she's down there. So actually, what I want to do, let me see if I can do this without messing stuff. So here's the 3 areas of management, right? Like as I mentioned, here's honey production, here's nucleus colonies. This is the typical equipment that I'm using to start the nukes in. If you guys are familiar with Kirk Webster, this is his. I'm just copying, pasting everything that he's already improved and innovated with. Michael Palmer used to use this system of nukes until he innovated and improved upon it for him and his management scheme with his method of nukes, where he's using a solid divider in his bottom box, and then he's got these little supers, the 4/4, the Palmer style nuke, equipment. And I've done both of those, and I've come back to managing most of, I'd say 95% of my nucleus colonies with this type of equipment, with a division board feeder, and starting them off 2 to a box, and then gradually giving them their own deep super, with 8 combs oriented kind of more horizontally than vertically for my management. So here's the mating nucleus colonies. So there's nucleus and mating nucleus colonies. This is just, again, Kirk Webster. I'm going to give him the props on this, and there's probably other people that have done this too, but he really kind of promoted this Brother Adams kind of hybrid, right? If you guys are familiar with Brother Adams, and he had dance style equipment or sized equipment, and essentially Kirk was a big fan of Brother Adams, like many beekeepers, are today or have been, anyways. He took Brother Adams' dance style mating 4-way mating nukes and adapted it to the Langstroth equipment. So it's just kind of that in a nutshell. And this is a nice equipment to mate queens in. There's many ways to do this. There's always trade-offs. There's some downsides to this equipment, but at the same time, for what I've done and what I'm doing, this is a really nice way to mate queens and to get them caught and accounted for within a day or a day and a half. If you've got a big, population of mated queens, you got to pull out of these and then, or catch them and then resell them the day after or whatever, to keep the whole queen breeding program going throughout the summer months. So we're into spring, right? I just mentioned we're going to go through the seasonal kind of management things, or management of what I do in my small commercial apiary. And I guess we'll have to answer questions. I usually feed off questions throughout this type of the part of the presentation, but I'm just going to push through and see if we come up with so many questions at the end. So like every beekeeper up in the northern climate, where you're wintering your bees, we have to unpack and evaluate colonies. In the honey production yards, this is where I locate breeder queens. This is the population of bees that has gone the longest and kind of been fighting. They got their gloves on when it comes to varroa mites. They've gone 2 years. These particular queens and colonies have gone 2 seasons without any treatments. And this is where you can kind of, you don't have to have this long list of, kind of notes to kind of evaluate queens. You just have to, keep the queen records, on the colonies. But my point is that all you got to do is observe over time and make sure you got the right queen in every box that, corresponds to the notes you're observing with. But with a couple seasons worth of observations, and with things looking at you as far as for how much honey they produce, how much, you can go through all the things that everyone looks at, honey production, gentle behavior. You could get into phenotypes like color or whatever. But for me, going 2 seasons without treatments in the onset of what I was doing in my breeding program, I felt like there's something special with those queens. If they can go 2 full seasons without treatments for mites, then there's something going on. And this is in the days, about, it's crazy to think it's this long ago, but like 15 or 16, 10, over a decade ago, we didn't have any way to measure resistance for mites. I mean, there was ways. Harbo, I forget Harbo's partner, Corey's going to expound on that maybe. But anyways, there were some people in the industry that were doing these really, labor intensive essays to measure mite resistance. But for most people like me and many others, you didn't have the ability or the know-how to really, or the time to measure resistance. So I felt the best way at the time, and still today, it's a good starting point, but now we can really fine tune it even further. But to really let natural selection play out in the colonies, you need that. There's things that we don't know enough about. You need to have a really broad selection pressure that only nature or natural selection really knows how to do to select. So locating the breeder queens in my honey production colonies is that I pushed a button, is where I am able to find those older populations of queens and then further refine the selection by, either like today doing a UBO on those populations of queens, or even, I've been doing Harbo assays for the last couple of years now. So just making sure that if there's any queens that haven't been assayed for Harbo, that we run that and see what they look like up against that. So it's just a really nice way to select and to come up with a nice population of bees to breed from, or queens to breed from. And we also reverse our brood nests in the spring in those honey production colonies. So that's all. Those two tasks are done in the spring. Meanwhile, simultaneously, right? There's 3 tiers of management in my apiary. So simultaneously, here in the spring, we have a population of nucleus colonies that have come through the winter. These nukes were raised last year with last year's queens. They are last year they have the daughters of last year's breeders. So already, from a breeding perspective, you have this little window into this population of bees that were raised last year. You can see already how well they've mated, obviously because they've come through, but you can see how well they winter. It's fascinating to see from yard to yard and family to family that I manage, that there's some families that just have more gusto and more vigor and more spring build. It's so fun to see the variances and the differences in the families. In some years, everything's kind of homogenized and mixed, so there's not much variances. But there are some years in the nucleus colonies with all these young daughter queens of last year's breeders where you can, as a breeder, you can see what you're playing with, and you kind of get a little window into the potential, right? So these queens, obviously, in these nucleus colonies, I use to replace all my winter losses. So in that case, those young queens go into honey production, then they produce honey and they'll go into another winter. And then the following spring, that's when we'll start to look at them as potential breeders again. So we kind of roll these queens through this natural selection process, plus a management practice, of trying to promote commercially viable stock, in my apiary, because we're trying to produce honey. We're trying to actually do something with bees more than just kind of let them just sit in boxes and swarm all the time. So we relocate the nukes into production yards and we replace our own losses. I sell off the surplus of what I don't need. So that's the biggest thing that I offer to the beekeeping public up in my neck of the woods are overwintered nucleus colonies with really nice, partially vetted queens. It's a product that I always tell people, and I know other guys that are big on this whole thing. It's not apples to apples when it comes to packages, right? Overwintered nucleus colonies in our neck of the world, in regards to what I'm talking about here, a cohesive unit of bees that have come through their first winter. These things are a whole different animal than just package bees. And I tell people that are just getting into bees, that are buying these things from me for the first time, especially if spring's really ramped up, when you get these, I sell them in 5 frames, 5 frames of they're overwintered nukes on 5 combs, but you get them into your 10 frame equipment and you're gonna need to give them more room pretty quick. You're not going to be able to abide within the same parameters of a package, right? But regardless, I tell them it's an explosive kind of energy with these overwintered nukes. So the mating nukes. So we had honey production, nucleus colonies. So in the springtime, we also have a population of bees on these mini combs, right? I have this equipment doesn't just kind of get put into the winter shed and stuck away for the winter and then restocked with bees every year. My whole thing is to have every box that I have, the longer I can, a box without bees in my storage building is not good, right? From a business perspective, I want bees in boxes. That's what's going to generate revenue. That's what gets me excited about beekeeping. My whole system, and everybody who's in bees will agree, right? When bees are in boxes, things work better. The equipment, doesn't go to moths or beetles, or life is better when you have beekeeping equipment occupied with its intended purpose, that to occupy bees. So these mating nukes I winter over. So I look at this whole population of mini combs and bees as a big queen bank. So if let's say I have in the fall, we consolidate a lot of these mating nukes. As you can see, the dividers on this picture are pushed to the front and back. And so there's 2 colonies in this one box. So obviously, when we're mating queens, we move those feeders to the middle and we turn the half sections into quadrants. So a lot of these are consolidated to 2 to a box. And I have, anywhere from 200 to 150, some years 200 plus mated queens on these combs. I don't need that many queens in this equipment, right? Because they're all going to swarm pretty quickly. As you can see, this is a picture that was taken, I think, in early April, right as we unpacked them, and they're already boiling over. So another few weeks of a little bit of a honey flow or something, nature stimulating them otherwise is going to push these bees right out into the wild. So I don't need all these queens. So this is a big bank. I can come in here every day or whenever I need some queens throughout the early part of the spring, harvest the queens, and then I have these boxes of bees and brood, and all I do is pile this box on top of another queen right box and just have these big stacks of bees and brood with queens in them just to keep the brood on the combs. And then later in the spring, when it's time to mate the queens, we'll come through and deconstruct these back into mating nukes again. So this is a big, wonderful aspect of my apiary that makes the whole apiary really resilient, is having these populations of queens from last year on these mini combs, and it's just a big bank of queens. I don't have to go buying somebody else's queens. It's all in-house, and that's the wonderful thing. When all 3 areas of management are working together, this operates flawlessly. Brother Adams did the same thing in his apiary. If you guys read his Beekeeping at Buckfast Abbey, he talks about how he would go out in the morning, harvest his queens out of his mating yard, go to the colonies in his honey production yards and requeen, and then bring those old queens back to his mating yard just to keep his mating nukes going with the queen. I don't do it that intensely, but this is the same kind of idea as him. So one thing I want to touch base on is I think if you're running a big commercial apiary, I'm talking thousands of hives, it'd be really hard to do management like this that I'm doing. It'd be hard to manage nucleus colonies like this. You're gonna be more streamlined for the sake of trying to be productive. So these are the little nuances. Again, when you're a small commercial apiary, you can dial this stuff in and you can do some really cool things that a lot of other areas of commercial beekeeping really can't do. And I think in some regards has been overlooked and forgotten. So I want to try to always remind you guys of this as we go through the talk here. So we divide up the mating nukes, like I said, the second bullet point, into quadrants by the end of May, and for the first round of red queen cells that are now going to be coming available. So we're at this point in the spring where April's kind of passing us by. We're getting out of April. The bees are unpacked. Nukes are kind of getting moved into honey production yards. We've sold off some bees. And now May is upon us. And this is when queen rearing in my apiary starts to kind of ramp up. And this is a typical colony of, not typical, but this is a nice showy colony of an overwintered colony coming out of winter. I think I just reversed this brood nest. So anyways, queen breeding. This happens again in May. We start to really set up cell builders. I think the second week in May is typically the date that I always try to see if I can work with the bees to start to prepare them to raise cells. I'm really not actually going to start grafting until the end of May. For me, I try to wait for some nectar and pollen readily coming in with some nice temperatures that are stable, so that the bees can really do a good job just being stimulated by nature and not by me to raise cells. So queen breeding, this paradigm sets the stage for good selection of breeding stock, like I already mentioned, because you have 3 tiers of management. You have this population of bees you have three populations of bees being managed in three kind of different ways. So you can look to the older populations of bees, which for me are in the honey production yards for breeders. You know, you can use the mating nukes to house a big bank of queens for replacing your own queens with. But in a sense, this paradigm sets the stage for good selection and a good breeding program. And natural selection, as I had mentioned, and specific selection, you know, now that we have tools that are coming available. So you have natural selection. I talked about this just a little bit ago, plus what's becoming available through different assays like the Harbo assay or UBO. All these things now can be utilized to further expound and to distill and improve upon, I think, what already has been a really wonderful thing. But this will just make this, it's like putting a turbocharger on it in some ways. It's just really going to make things really interesting. I'm really excited about the future, you know, with what's before us in regards to this way to quantify certain resistant traits, and who knows what else is going to come down the road. But you can see how there's this table that's set, and with what's with other people's hard work and innovative mindsets and contributions to the industry, you can just tap into that and further make the whole thing work better. So I've talked about breeder queens already. We like to raise queen cells. So for those who are already having a basic idea on cell building, what I use in my cell building yards are like a starter finisher colony in one, where I don't have a starter colony and I don't go to a finisher colony. I kind of do, I start the cells and finish the cells all in the same colony. So, and we raise around 1,200 mated queens in a season. So that's mated queens. If I was to do if with with Corey Stevens, approach, that he's really educating a lot of people on how to use virgins, I could probably do more, but it's really, mated queens have kind of been my MO since I started. But I keep thinking, oh my gosh, I have all this infrastructure in regards to the mating nucleus colonies that I wouldn't really need if I was selling virgins. So, and there's a lot of effort and labor that goes into just making those mating nukes, let alone, getting the queens in and out of them. So here's a nice picture of some cells. This is probably, I think, the 8th day in the larval, it's just we have larvae just starting to pupate. So this is the day, I think, right at the day where they start to, it looks like it, if I remember correctly, that this is the day when they kind of capped the cells, or the cells are freshly capped. So this would be the day that you could, I guess, in theory, move them into an incubator. But I don't incubate cells until they're about 14, 13 days old. If I do incubate them at all, I let the bees do all the incubating. So the 8-day schedule, I want to keep pushing here. This is really what makes this whole, this is the schedule that makes my management work. Because without this schedule, everything would fall apart. The schedule makes it so that I can raise queens, I can manage my honey production colonies, and at the same time manage a population of nucleus colonies without everything falling apart. As I had mentioned earlier in the talk, you have to make all three areas of management work together. They can't rob Peter to pay Paul. If you're going to be productive, you have to find a way to make it work. And the only way, obviously, in farming to make all these things work is schedule. You have to have something that allows you to get at all three areas effectively and efficiently, and being able to enjoy it all the while, right? I mean, there's a lot of times where I'm just ramming and jamming, but this schedule really does all that. It makes all three parts of this apiary work, and at the same time, it keeps it fun. It makes it, every day of the schedule is like a little bit that you can bite off. It's not asking too much. Some days it feels like it, but welcome to agriculture. So I copied the schedule again from my friend Kirk Webster. He got it originally. He kind of improvised off of I forget his name. He was a French Canadian beekeeper who was on a 4-day schedule, like what most queen breeders or queen producers are on 4-day schedules. He just said, I'm going to, turn this into an 8-day schedule to allow some breathing room in the breeding schedule to get out to other areas of the apiary to manage. So if you're just going to look at the schedule as far as like trying to learn a new song, being that as James, guitar is one of those things that have just stuck with me over the years. So if you're musically minded and you want to kind of get familiar with, kind of a new song, there's a rhythm, there's a repetitiveness. So the schedule has this repetitiveness. It goes through setup, prepare, graft, catch queens, you put out cells, there's a day off, you work breeders, and then you have another day off. So what does that look like? So for one round of cells, this is what it looks like. You would, for example, you'd select the day you want to graft. Most breeding or queen propagating, if you will, you always kind of figure the grafting day is kind of like what everything's focused around. So hypothetically here, I have, this is a calendar, believe it or not, and it's like a 1.5 month calendar to get you guys oriented here. So I chose the 11th day of this month, of the first month here, as a grafting day, and I count back 10 days. And you count back 10 days, that's your setup day. And why do you count back 10 days? Well, you count back 10 days for a lot of things to fit within the parameters of the schedule. Plus, 10 days before you graft allows your cell builders to be without any larvae and any eggs. That's part of the success in this, in my queen rearing scheme that makes grafting really work nicely, is that you have no eggs or larvae. You're not shaking bees out at the last second, where there's maybe something you can overlook something. If you give yourself some time to work with, everything kind of works nicely. And that's what the schedule will do. So you set up your colony. What does setting up mean? Setup is where you take a double deep colony with at least 8 or 9 frames of brood. That's really crucial. And obviously you want to make sure there's a nice little honey flow, nectar flow, pollen coming in. All the ingredients are there from Mother Nature pushing the bees to raise cells. So you'd go into that double deep and you'd take a queen excluder with you and you'd put her in the bottom box. And while you do all this work, you cull any cells, cups with eggs, larvae, capped queen cells. Obviously make sure they didn't swarm, but put the queen in the bottom box and get rid of any impulse, get rid of any cells that would cause the bees to swarm before the day you graft. So then after you've done that, that's your setup day. You wait 6 days. And then for me, all my breeder queens are confined to one deep super, but within the deep, they're confined to 3 combs. A lot of you guys might be familiar with this, but you have a lot of breeders will confine queens to smaller comb space, so that essentially what I'm doing is rotating an empty dark drawn comb onto the queen side of the partition that I use to consolidate her onto 3 combs. So I do this in the morning. I find if I do this after 9:30, I always miss the queens. I just kind of get busy laying in other combs, and I come back on my grafting day and I have nothing but eggs still. So I try to do this, and this will take, with half a dozen or a dozen breeders, it takes maybe a half hour just to swap over combs in the morning. So that's the one thing I want to talk about too, like the setup and the work breeders kind of on what it looks like in a day is a very small portion of your day. Setting up the colonies, I have, for one colony, I graft 50 cells, and I need about 250 cells every week, every 8 days for me to, maybe 250 is like a nice, it's like the bare minimum. Actually, there's some days I set up 6 cell builders, so I have I overproduce for the sake of any cells that are duds, so I have 200 queen cells that I need in my mating area. So my point is that setting up and working the breeders, this takes just maybe, setting up the colonies might take a couple hours, maybe two hours to do all the work with setting up, and then working the breeders might take half an hour. So you can see how on these specific tasks in the schedule, it's not occupying your whole day. You still can get away and do a lot of other things, but you just stick to this gradual, nice kind of repetitive schedule, and the work just gets done. So after you work your breeders, 3 days go by, and then you're at the next step on the schedule, and that's prepare. This is an optional day. You can tie this in with grafting day. Prepare really is like if grafting day is a rainy, miserable day. So what I do to prepare is to alleviate a lot of the heavy lifting on grafting day, so that I can set up the cell builders to graft into, and I'm not, under some pop-up tent for an ungodly amount of time, really just shaking my fist at the weather, saying, what am I doing? So preparing really spreads the workload around and makes the risk on bad weather days a little bit more tolerable. And essentially what that is, you go through your cell builders where the queens are below the excluders, you cull any queen cells again, you take out 2 frames in the top box, in the box above your excluder. Those 2 frames, obviously, you're going to make space, 1 frame for your grafting frame, 1 frame for the frame that I get for pollen. And that's pretty much setting up the day you graft. That's kind of a full day, right? The prepare day is again, maybe a couple hours or an hour of work. The grafting day is really a full day of work. So the grafting days for me are days I don't really get away to other areas of management. So what that looks like, I get out in the morning and I go into those colonies that I either prepared the day before, or I'm going to prepare them and graft into them today. And I essentially go through, and the queens that are below the excluders in this double deep brood nest now are either moved to a different yard for some people that want to move to relocate the queens, or in my case, I just move them onto different stands within the same apiary. So I move the queen out of the equation of the colony, and now I'm left with a box that was above the excluder that has a bunch of brood that's emerging. There's no eggs, no larvae, there's nectar and pollen coming in. So you kind of get the point here. There's no way that these bees are going to raise a queen. And they're already got this impulse to swarm, right? They got a little bit of a drive for raising nice cells. So what you do is you just put that colony that's been above the excluder on its own stand, provide them with the frame of freshly packed pollen where you put next to the graft. That's crucial. I think a lot of other breeders and people who breed and propagate queens will mention that the pollen frame. And then I shake about 5 to 6 frames of nurse bees from the queen rights super that you move to a different stand back into this cell builder. And you look if done right, that's the trick. By having 8 or 9 frames of brood on the setup day, you will have plenty of nurse bees to shake and to play with in this colony. And then essentially what you do after getting the nurse bees all stocked in these colonies is you wait. You want those bees to recognize that they're without a queen. It doesn't take too long. I give them a couple hours and you can come back and the bees are running all over the faces of the hives, and they're desperate. They just say, give us a queen. And then you know you're ready. And that's the trick to having a really successful take on grafting, is having nurse bees. The second you drop those grafts in, just stick to, they just get right to work. They're not saying, whoa, what's that all about? And oh, wait a minute, an hour later, a couple hours later, they realize they're, that's larvae they need to turn into queens. You want those bees right on that graft, turning that, supplying them with jelly, royal jelly, and getting the work of raising nice queens. So that's grafting day. And after you graft, then you kind of have this, you can do a couple of things. 5 days after I graft, I reunite the queen back under my graft to have a finisher colony essentially. So you let those queen cells go their route. And then, oh gosh, I got this. I'm making sure I shouldn't do this, but someone just texted me. I just want to make sure it's not James. I think if it was James, he'd probably say, Troy, it's 15 minutes. Yes,
Yep,
15.
15 minutes.
So anyways, you're putting out cells, and then anyway, you guys get the idea. This is the schedule. Here's what it looks like with multiple batches of queens. I raise around 8 batches of queens. It looks confusing, but it really isn't. Everything's staggered. That's what's about the 8-day that makes it nice. You have setup right down the row. So you just set up as many batches of queens that you need until you get your target number of queens. And then when you're done, you're done. But this is what makes this whole thing work. And you have 2 days to get away and manage other parts of the apiary. In the summer, we continue to add supers to the honey production colonies as needed. And we also begin making up nukes because we have queens coming available now. Making up nukes, there's many ways to do it. Here's the way I've been able to do it, and where I feel like I can, again, make the most, the most advantage of the resources I have. I have a yard of colonies that we overwintered. Typically, they're nucleus colonies, but they weren't strong enough to sell. They weren't strong enough to requeen other areas of the apiary with, but they're healthy. So now they've built up, and a lot of them are building up into 2 deeps, some even 3 deeps. So what I do is we go through I set aside around 70 to 80 of these overwintered nucleus colonies like this. And about the middle of June, there's a percentage of them that are just about ready to swarm. And so essentially you're on the schedule, you're making up I'm making up nucleus colonies every week, every 8 days. So I can come back to the same location and just make up a round of nukes. And I typically make up around anywhere from 100 to 120, 130 nucleus colonies every 8 days until I've reached the target number of nukes that I need for the season. And that's about 5 weeks of nuke production. I can come up with around 400 to 350 nucleus colonies. So I take one of these colonies that have built up into 2 or 3 deeps. And then for every colony, we typically can make around 6 nukes in a good year. In a bad year like last year, we made 4.5 to 5 nukes. So that number fluctuates, but you can get the idea. You're getting an increase of 6 for every colony. Not only was that colony initially that you're making the nukes up from non-productive in the spring, but you've taken a non-productive colony and you've capitalized on it to help push it into the apiary in a different way. Plus, you're requeening all those colonies with new, freshly mated queens from this year's breeders. Just go back here real quick. I'm going to start pushing through. That's the thing. It always slips away. The nukes are started with a frame of honey, 2 frames of brood, frame of pollen, frame of foundation. That's kind of the stereotypical thing to do up here in this part of the world of making up nukes. Nice picture of a honey production yard. These are the Palmer style nukes. This is a long time ago when I was just kind of getting nuke production figured out. I used a lot of this equipment. And this is what they look like in the late fall, bearded out, on a nice day with the knotweed honey flowing process or going. They're packed with honey and they're just doing their thing. Here's again the picture of the nukes as we make them up. And as these nukes start to kind of now build up and the brood starts to establish itself and you have generations of bees hatching out, we'll typically expand. Oh gosh, we'll typically expand those nucleus colonies onto 8 combs. The first couple generations of nukes that we make get 8 combs and the feeder pushed to the side. So the strongest population obviously go into the winter with just a single deep and a feeder. Pick honey production. As we begin to look at late summer and harvest, we obviously now are starting to wind down queen rearing, and you can see everything kind of works nicely like a typical small family farm or small farm used to do. You know, one season would wind into the next, and every kind of thing would wax and wane, and you'd have now the time to focus on harvest as in the early part of the year you're planting. So we begin to look at the harvest of honey. If there's a big crop, we can begin to start to do that as nukes are no longer being made up anymore, and the mating yards are need, the queen rearing is slowing down. We can now focus on harvesting. And we at the same time have a population of nucleus colonies that we just made up throughout the summer. So we manage those accordingly and give them room as they need to keep them from swarming. And as I mentioned, queen rearing ends and the cycle comes to a close. That 8-day cycle comes to a close in August. And it's such a nice experience to have this pressure of being free and on my own schedule and not the bees anymore. Here's a picture of us harvesting some honey off of a yard. Just again, with my truck and what the bees look like after we've harvested the supers. They're kind of all back down into 2 deeps. Another yard, we harvest honey. Extracting, having the infrastructure to extract and to properly and efficiently harvest honey is crucial, especially if honey production is going to be part of that. There's a lot of discussions and YouTube videos on all this, so I'm not going to linger on this too long. But essentially, when I started to make the investment into this system in particular that I have today, it's really opened up my schedule tremendously to be able to harvest the volume of honey that we need to get off the bees and into where it needs to be for market. And then the fall we begin feeding. I feed 2 to 1 as needed. I open feed because in some locations it's remote. I don't have to worry about other beekeepers, robbing out my feed and contaminating another beekeeper's crop of honey or in general. So I'm pretty confident and done this for a while now that open feeding in some locations is fun, not is applicable for me. And obviously for you guys, you have to feel that out. I wouldn't recommend it unless you do your homework. But so we have the feeders and the nukes, we feed syrup through that. And then on the production colonies, we'll open feed or we'll use can feeders. All the bullet points here are pretty typical for beekeepers wintering their bees in the north as far as for target weight on production colonies. And what I like to see for nucleus colonies is, essentially they just feel really heavy. That's not a really good way to describe it to you guys. But if you were to measure, I think if you took a single deep, a nuke and a single deep, it'd weigh 60 to maybe 70. Some of them, if they're really packed with honey, might even get to 80 pounds. But 60, 65, 70 pounds is efficient for one single, 1 8-frame nuke. Mouse guards in obviously before the mouse moves in, and the finish. I need to be done feeding by October. So pushing through, nice pictures of some nukes with some protein patties. I want to emphasize with you guys real quick, nutrition is so important. You got to pay attention. If the bee, especially in a population of nucleus colonies, these are baby colonies, right? They don't have the stores like their big sisters in a sense with production colonies. If they fall back on honey and pollen, these guys are cooked. They need to be in this continuous forward growth pattern from the time you make them up to the time nature shuts them down. I find in years where there's a little bit of a dearth, they can handle that. But once you start getting into, several weeks of a dearth and the queen starts shutting down, you just your efforts are going to be lost. So for me, I've paid attention to that dynamic really carefully, and I've learned the hard way, but I am not afraid of finding or putting on a lot of protein supplements if it's needed. Last year was one of those years they needed it, so we gave it right to them. Pale feeders. This is what the 4-way mini nukes look like if they're positioned nicely going into the winter. Again, it's like bonsai beehives is the best way to describe it. Everyone's like, how do you winter those small little populations of bees? Well, the bees know what cavity size they're occupying, and they just proportion everything accordingly to the cavity. And if they're all 4 quadrants look like this, I winter a lot of these mating nukes just like this, so I can go into the winter with 1 box occupying 4 mated queens. And we prepare the colonies for winter. This is where we begin wrapping. It's early, late October, early November. Just typical, very light preps for wintering, 1/2-inch blue board on the grain bags, inner covers, and we wrap with tar paper. Nothing too, I have a little way I pack the nukes, but I don't want to get it. There's not much time for that. So some pictures of what that looks like. The nukes getting packed. Tie them down. Nice picture of some winter bees. In the winter, we look at rest and we repair and make equipment. We make foundations. That's one of the things I like about what I can do is I can tap into some long and forgotten, not that it's the most efficient or it's not meant for everybody, but we make foundation, my own beeswax foundation. We plan for next season. I always think about what I can improve upon. There's some pictures of some foundation. That's a whole thing. If you guys are interested in, I can expound on that, or you can contact me and I'll share with you what I've learned about making foundation. But it's really fun to see bees drawing out poems on your own wax that came from last year's crop of honey. Real quickly, I want to emphasize something about this whole thing of looking to the future, if I can find it in my notes here. Bear with me. Oh, so here's the whole in my, I think, where is it? Sorry, I'm not gonna waste too much time. I can't find it. Mite washings.
You don't feel too pressured.
Right.
You got Corey coming up next, and he's just gonna saunter in whenever he's ready. So
Okay. So this is the thing that I have a hard time articulating with people who don't know who I am, or they look at me as some weirdo. Again, my being a reputation, they might see me as the treatment-free beekeeper who needs to be kept at arm's length. And I get it. But at the same time, here I I being that I'm breeding, that's my focus, right? It's all about your focus and your goals within your apiary and in with what you're trying to do with bees. And part of what my passion in my apiaries is breeding. So I'm always letting that kind of overshadow other decisions I'm making in regards to honey production and kind of general commercial beekeeping practice, right? I'm breeding queens, so I'm willing to compromise. That's not the right word. I'm willing to subject a population of bees within my apiary to the experiment, if you will, to the pressures, to whatever you want to call it. I'm willing to take a little more risk than most beekeepers would because I'm breeding. And that a lot of people on a commercial level would say that's foolish. You can't have it all. You have to pick. And I understand and I get that completely. You can be a commercial beekeeper. To be a commercial beekeeper, you gotta have it's a business. You got to generate revenue, and revenue is going to pay your bills. It's what keeps you in business. So if your bees are dying every year for the sake of some breeding experiment, you're not a commercial beekeeper. It's a business that's going to fail, and it's going to, anyways, that hasn't been my reality. I haven't failed to the point yet. But the point I'm trying to make is I take the population that I have, particular of honey producing colonies, and I'm willing to let those populations of bees be pushed a little harder and not be so prophylactic with treatment for the sake of letting natural selection push for selection, whether it's resistance or letting the bees figure out a lot of things how to deal with mites. And at the same time, having a playing field every season to further evaluate now with the proper tools that we're getting online. And the nice thing about all this is like with the technology and innovation coming online, I might find that I can do things differently, or I don't have to do or subject a population like I normally would have done because it's just the only way I've been able to do it. There's new ways to do this where I could probably save a population of bees more so than I could have. I'm not just some hard-headed guy thinking like this is the only way. I'm willing to innovate and adapt. But that's the thing I want to emphasize for a lot of you people, a lot of you individuals who might not understand the dynamics of what I'm doing. And the reality is anybody who's a really good breeder, anybody who's like bred for resistance, over the last 20, 30 years since we've had mites, probably the last 25 years, you ask them what they do and you ask them where their population of bees, their breeder stock is coming from. Guess where it's coming from, folks? Untreated bees. Historically, that's the reality. So the whole industry has really worked in a scheme like we've leaned on the backs of people who have kind of done things on the fringes for the sake of everybody's benefit. And I get it. But at the same time, this management scheme that I've just elaborated on really allows you to kind of have this freedom, obviously with some intuition, with some practical experience, with some hands-on, I wouldn't say don't jump into this overnight. You'll probably crash and burn. Grow into it, learn how to do it, adapt to your climate, know how to work your bees, have your kind of some goals mapped out on what you're trying to do with your apiary. But this is a holistic, nicely balanced, simple way, complex way, small scale. You're allowed to really fine tune and dial in certain things that other people can't do based upon your preferences and what you're trying to do. You're not chasing, some pollination contracts or whatever on a commercial mindset, but you can you can focus on some areas that a lot of, I think, the industry commercially has overlooked for the sake of whatever it might be to the individual beekeeper collectively as the industry. But essentially, in a nutshell, I hope I was able to articulate to you all my passion, my kind of mind around why I'm doing what I'm doing, and really I want to promote this. I want to get people excited and maybe see if there's anybody who's, if I can sell this in some way, not like, as a, try to make money, but it's just push the idea out to the general population of beekeepers, especially those looking to make a vocation out of this, that you don't have to go like for example, for me, a product of my generation, in order to be successful, you have to go to college. Yes, that's true. But you just need to be a person who has a solid character set, and you need to be somewhat motivated. I think those are the priorities before you get to college. Is you need to actually be, you need to be an honest, upright human being who actually has some drive, as opposed to, somebody who's looking to get the easiest, just looking to get by in the quickest way they can, and taking advantage of everyone else around them. Plus, you get educated, so you become an educated idiot, as opposed to a well-rounded individual who's upright and honest and willing to learn something as life shows them they need it. Anyways, that's my rant. But so thank you guys. Any questions here? I'll probably linger for a little bit, but then I got to get going with my day. But I appreciate the opportunity to share with you all. And so how do I give you the screen back? I'll stop share.
You could stop share and you could turn your camera on if you want to take a couple of questions.
Stop share. Start video.
Hi, Troy. There he is.
There I am.
So there's like a bajillion questions, so we'll grab a few of them. We ran right to time, but we're still waiting for Corey. So when Corey arrives, so we'll exit stage right. But can you see the Q&A screen as a panelist? That way, if you decide to linger, you could try to tackle them once Corey does get going.
I'm looking for it.
So while you look for that, the first one is when do you do your first queen catch?
First queens are caught about the 13th to the 15th of June.
And how many hives did you have this going into this last winter?
We wrapped, I think we put to bed 720, 710 or 720 colonies. That's
yeah, and this, go ahead.
No, go ahead. That's I don't need to, that's the answer.
And then for your expenses, your income, like what is a Cliff Notes version of how you track all of that? Like, do you have somebody who helps you with accounting? Do you use QuickBooks? How do you manage the financial aspect of your operation?
Keep it small, keep it all. No, I'm the accountant. Yeah, I have a friend who was an accountant. So if I have some financial stuff that's kind of like, hey, how would you look at this? How would you do this so that it doesn't come up to be some funny thing, later in the future, accounting wise? I'll lean into them or some people that can guide me. But for the most part, I just use QuickBooks, or even some other accounting software that's out there to, help keep track of your business, your revenue and expenses and cash flow and all the other fun stuff.
And then briefly, you did a talk for us back in December of 22, I think it was, coming back from the brink, when you shared some of your trials and the losses you experienced the previous year and how you kind of built back up from that. One of the questions from Brad was, what was the factor that caused you to want to treat the 20% of your production colonies?
Mainly, there was a little bit of fear. I will be honest. I couldn't take another hit like that, too close to losing the end of there. I just couldn't do it. I would have probably it would have put me out of business in a sense, or I would have had to, it would have been so much. Yeah, I didn't want to repeat 90% mortality. So I was a little bit fearful, and I didn't know exactly what was going on. I had an idea, but at the same time, I didn't feel like I had complete control over mitigating that from happening again. So I decided to be a little more proactive and, again, mitigate the risk and kind of go the normal route of treating some colonies that clearly looked like they needed to be treated at the appropriate time when we harvested the honey. And I ended up treating those colonies, just to kind of stave off any extra mortality that was unnecessary. So anyway, if that answers the question.
Yeah. And then if anybody wanted to hear, he did a really great job discussing a lot of those concerns with that on that SPGMI video on our YouTube channel. Why were your covers tilted on your honey count. I think it was your honey stacks.
Oh
Why were
yeah.
the
I don't know why I did it that year. I just I felt like I sometimes do things and think, well, let's see if it's just mainly because of it's some sort of little bit of an interest or something I have. But there's some beekeepers up here who will prop their outer covers up. You know, if you have telescoping outer covers, they'll just prop them up on the inner covers just to allow for better ventilation. And I figured that you know that summer was hot and humid in particular, so I went around to a couple yards and did that to see if it would help. And to be honest with you, I don't think it. I couldn't see or feel like it did much help, but it made me feel like I did something. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that that's a lot of beekeeping, right? A lot of what we do has has a lot to do with what we feel we're able to impact to give us this semblance of control over things.
yes,
Yeah, I don't know. I think I've given up hope. Like I just go out there, I do what I think's gonna work, and then I don't have an expectation because normally I'm disappointed when I go out there with expectations. They
yeah,
just do what they want.
yeah.
Um, your top three criteria for selecting breeder queens.
Top three criteria. I would say that I have some at this point in time having some sort of quantifiable way to measure resistance. Primarily right now that's being Harbo assays. So they have to have a very high Harbo score. I will, you know, if you guys are familiar with that, John Harbo has a 1 to 4 score on the, you know, the expression of VSH, Aurora sensitive hygiene, you know, in the queens. And I'd say I do accept some threes. Heck, there's some twos that I'd take because there's something about them that's there. But essentially, I like to select 2, 3, and 4 scoring Harbo queens. That's priority number one. Obviously, with UBO now, I'm going to be using that this spring and seeing what that has to contribute to the mix of being able to again quantify and measure. So the varroa, I want bees. Number one is to be able to deal with mites without a lot of input from my end as a beekeeper. Priority number one is that, and then I look to the kind of the rounding out the edges of that population when it comes to looking at honey production. Since I produce honey, that's a big revenue stream for me. So I need a crop of honey. So honey production. Then I look at gentleness, and then actually it's in somewhere in between 2 and 3. I do actually look for for color, just to make because I am open mating everything here. So if I can constantly select for dark phenotypes, dark colors in regards to the bees, and I consistently 1 year to the next are getting these dark bees, dark drones, queens, drones, and even the workers. I know that I can rest assured to some degree, right, that my open mating scheme is targeted. I'm getting the targeted matings that I'm looking for. So if that helps answer those top 3 priorities, that's kind of what I'm up against.
Yeah, have you ever used cloak boards in your cell builders?
I've never used them. Never used them. I guess I see how it would help. I'm familiar with the process, but I've just kind of set sail with what I've been doing. And when the season begins, it's like, unless I make the decision beforehand to do that, to use something new, to implement something new, once I get going, it's hard to change in the middle of to switch horses in the middle of the stream.
Are your mating yards isolated enough to where you feel you could control the drone mothers?
Yes, obviously open mating. I can't, anyone who says 100% unless you're on an island somewhere, is I think fooling themselves. But I'd say within a decent percentage, that being probably 75, 80, maybe even a little more than that. But I think my targeted matings are in that 80%, which I am very comfortable with. I'm not, 100% was never an expectation I wanted to get to. But if I just from what I'm seeing again with the colors of the bees as being kind of the leading factor that makes me feel secure in that. But I'd say, yeah, that 75, 80%.
Do you treat your cell builders proactively, or do you address them when the mites build up in them?
No. So throughout the season, I don't do, so the only time I treat, right now that I've been treating, if I need to treat, is after we pull honey. And our cell builders, coincidentally, or just because of the way things go, do also produce a crop of honey. So when we're done raising queens, there's honey on the bees, and when we come through the cell building yard and harvest honey, if any of those cell builders obviously are showing PMS or signs, that in about 60 days from now they're going to be dead bees, we'll throw formic on them if they're salvageable. If they're not salvageable, I usually just deconstruct them or requeen them. If they're salvageable, try to requeen them with this year's stock that's proven. But I don't, and if for me to treat, we kind of just go through, pull the crop of honey, evaluate, and even then doing some. I have a hard time with washes nowadays because like Corey Stevens has mentioned, and there's even doing washes, you're overlooking hygienic traits, hygienic behaviors in washes. You can have, how many of those mites in the wash are actually non-reproductive. So I've done that before, and I know Corey Stevens has mentioned it. I've seen it in my own apiary where you do a wash and it's about a 15% or 20% infestation or wash of mites, and you go and do a Harbo assay right then and there, and they're all non-reproductive. So it's like your mites, for whatever reason, have migrated in. But as John Keefis would once say, they're mite black, they're black holes. The mites go in, but they don't come out. So anyways, there's a lot of nuances to this. There's no right or wrong way, but I don't prophylactically treat cell builders.
On your queen banks or the queen mating, the 4 ways, are they overwintered above a single or are they on their own? And then
Yep,
as you overwinter them, do you keep them as single deeps for the winter?
they are overwintered traditionally in singles, as they are on I pack them 4 to a pallet, so they're kind of like packed in the same way, palletized and winterized like the traditional nukes would be, 4 deep supers, whether there's 2 in a box or 1 in a box or whatever for colonies. But they're on a pallet, single boxes. There are some years where I have in the past like consolidated a lot of the mating nukes, so we'll stack them up so they'll be doubled, and they winter beautifully that way. If I really feel like I've got a lot of queens, like we had too many queens, and I harvest them out late in the summer and sell them off, and I consolidate the equipment or at least one of the mating yards, so I'm not running over with queens every spring. I will consolidate, but for the most part, I winter them all in singles.
Do you like to super your nukes during the nectar flow?
I have in the past, and it's a lot of work. So typically, if it's a really gung ho, if it's a record year in a sense, where the nukes just kind of grow and grow, the first population of nukes just grow into like where they need 2 deep supers. Essentially, that's what I do now. Instead of keeping them constricted to single deeps, I will to some that need it, I'll just give them another deep, and just kind of they'll be double deep. They'll be a fully they're no longer nukes anymore. They're full size colonies going into the winter. But that's obviously only a small percentage of the nukes, the first rounds that we make that ever get to that point in a really good year.